and they can't discern and go
That
from
kind of
theater
brings
to
me to this question. How can theater affect or change a child's life?
Do you know any children's?
Children's.
Lives changed?
Well, I know children that have been involved in the shows have been greatly affected, and I think, you know, I've seen kids be really affected by shows they've seen at the theater, and I mean, it just can open up a, you know, different world. That, you know, if they're used to seeing things on television, I think it's...
Yeah, I feel strongly about that because I know I had no intention of getting into children's theater, really. It was all by kind of fortune and accident, but when I did, one of the very first shows I was involved in was a Lion, Witch, and Wardrobe, which we originally did a long time ago, and there was a line in that play that said, follow the truth in your heart, and I heard a story that a mother was driving her child down the street a week after seeing the play, and the child had seen it and turned to the mother and said, you know, Mom, the child was only 7 years old, and said, you know, Mom, it's really hard to follow the truth in your heart. You know, the mother nearly drove off the road. So you really are not playing for an audience. Sometimes now, if I am involved in a theater project for adults, I often get the impression, well, this is just something to do after you take a date out to dinner. You know, you go to the theater, or you bought a subscription, so now you have to go see this thing, or something like that. I think when you have children, though, in the audience, they're unformed to a certain extent, and you really can make a lasting impression the way that it's very difficult to do with adult audiences.
So they're more of a sponge. They absorb more of it than an adult might, or something. What about the advantaged child as opposed to the disadvantaged child? What would be an example or that you've seen of ways that it's affected those two extremes?
Well, and what do you mean necessarily by advantage or disadvantage?
How has it done something for a disadvantaged child?
Economically disadvantaged?
Yeah, and psychologically or mentally disadvantaged too. And then how is a child, say, that has everything, that's privileged, how's it maybe brought them closer to...
Well, I think there are two types of child. I mean, if you want to look at it from this one perspective, the way that there are probably for adults too, there are kind of, especially kids that are involved in performing or being in creative drama, there are kind of extroverted kids who want attention and who enjoy, you know, kind of doing all these things in front of people. And then there are introspective kids that are really not, they have the same kind of depth and concerns and everything, and more so, in fact, I think. But I think those kids can fit from being involved in theater activities because it gives them an opportunity to be involved in fantasy, which, you know, can be good for their self-esteem. They can imagine themselves in other circumstances. They can kind of have an opportunity in a fictional sense to replay things that have happened to them. And it can be very healing, or it can be very open a lot of doors psychologically, I think.
We took some footage last week. One of the crew went down and shot some footage of some of the goings-on. And I think we can cue that up by that, and maybe you could comment over that just a little bit. And we'll look at some other footage later of the costume shop. Well, Sherry, this is the costume shop. Maybe you can comment on this.
Sure. Oh, this is Kristen Pluhacek. She is our shop foreman, and she's working on, actually she's not working on a costume right now. We were helping out the set crew by making a curtain for the show, Amazing Grace. But this is just, you know, we cut the pattern. I cut the patterns, and if there's a commercial pattern that I can buy, I certainly buy it and save the time, but sometimes you have to make your own patterns. And here I am fitting Kenny for his Langston Hughes.
And here's some of your sketches, which are really quite handsome. Maybe you could comment on how you approach this process. Okay,
well, with this Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe, we decided to go more with the 1940s theme.
Okay.
And so you could see Mrs. Beaver has a few sort of her little jacket, sort of 1940s, and to make the animals more like people rather than just animals, because they do talk. You know, they have their little house with all the little bowls and everything, so they're more like people.
And here we have some footage of one of the productions, so we can kind of see the the realized product from your sketch.
Right. That's not a wolf from this particular show, but
okay.
What was that
show?
show?
What makes a successful costume design? I mean, how do you know that you've done your job well?
Well, I guess that, you know, the audience likes it and that they appreciate what's on stage. I mean, you know, I could say that, oh, it's something that the actor can move in really well or work in really well, but, you know, that is not so much the case, because then they'd always want to be in jeans and t-shirts. So sometimes they're unusual and they're very hot, and but if they're, you know, something that what I always like is you get the letters that kids have drawn their version of a certain costume, and that's neat to see, because they, you know, their version's always quite interesting.
Quite interesting. Do you, that kind of provokes a question. Where do you look for inspiration sometimes?
It varies. Like with The Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe, I looked at a lot of books in the 1940s, and but sometimes, like with Amazing Grace, it's a modern show, so sometimes I'll go to a shopping mall and watch people there, or...
sometimes you're working with existing books that have been illustrated by an author or whatever. Do you approach that differently than a play that has no previous imagery with it?
Well, we usually talk about it in our design meeting and decide. Sometimes we've even had people who don't want us to use their illustrations. And then some books are more identified with their illustrations and others aren't. And personally, like for me, I've always said, Curious George, don't screw with Curious George. I want him to look like Curious George. But so we usually decide if we're going to stick with the illustrations or if we're going to try something else. Like with Amelia Bedelia, we've done several times, and you know, I loved Amelia Bedelia too, but the drawings are not that set in my head. So it was nice to try it in different ways. So.